There are parallels going back to the beginning of the Second World War in 1939 in that we've got growing conflict across the world and we've got lots of diplomatic activity trying to fix it. If we get to that level of total war where things get joined together, our professional military will only last so long before it has to be backed up, replaced, reinforced by something. And that something has to come from the society it is there to protect.
As Russia begins to ramp up its attacks in Ukraine, combined with Western financial aid wavering for the besieged country, a growing number of NATO military voices have begun speaking out in fear of Russia expanding its war into Europe. So far, high-ranking military from the UK, Belgium, Holland, Germany, Norway and Sweden have reignited calls for conscription, which could see members of the British public called up for compulsory military service in order to bolster troop numbers in the likelihood of an all-out war. It's a terrifying prospect and something this country has not seen since the Second World War. But is this merely sensible planning, or should civilians really be preparing to go to war with Putin's Russia? Joining me to discuss this is former intelligence expert Philip Ingram. Philip, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Philip, I guess the first question is, should we be preparing ourselves for war?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I've been involved in international geopolitics from within the army and commentating on it for over 40 years. And we have to look at the context. We've got a major war in Europe. We've got a brewing potential conflict in the Middle East. And we've got a lot of activity down in Southeast Asia. For the first time ever in those 40 years, I can see not just one, but several paths that could lead to these being linked up and therefore lead to a global conflict. We're a long, long way off that at the moment, but I've never seen clear paths before.
Are we looking at the possibility of bringing back conscription in the UK and Europe? And what parallels are there with our position in 1939?
There are parallels going back to the beginning of the Second World War in 1939 in that we've got growing conflict across the world and we've got lots of diplomatic activity trying to fix it. We have to remember Neville Chamberlain coming back from negotiations with Nazi Germany and saying peace in our time as he waved his dockets as he got off the aircraft. That didn't last very long. So we have to be prepared. It takes time to get prepared. Are we anywhere near conscription now? No. There are European countries that have conscription as part of their activities and part of normal society. Would conscription work in the UK? No, not at the moment, because it would destroy our small professional military, and we need that to do what it's doing. It would turn it into a training machine, just acting as a sausage machine for new recruits going out and joining the military. And of course, conscription doesn't have to be just about joining the military. Germany had a model where you could choose to join the military, or you could choose to join other elements of society, the blue light services as ambulance drivers, or the fire service, or into the care society and providing individuals into care homes and help out in hospitals. So it doesn't automatically mean that we've got people going into military uniform. But if we get to that level of total war where things get joined together, our professional military will only last so long before it has to be backed up, replaced, reinforced by something. And that something has to come from the society it is there to protect. So there would be some form of calling people up to go into service. And that needs to be planned very far ahead, years ahead.
Has there been some new intelligence that's provoked this, or is it just speculative?
I don't think there's any new intelligence. I think what's in the press and what's happening across the world is enough to stimulate the thinking, because you can't just mobilize people and put them on the front line instantly. The operations that the British military are leading with international partners to train Ukrainians coming from normal society to turn them into soldiers who can be sent to the front line takes months to train them. So it would take years to get society into a position where it would change in a way to be able to enable the capability to do that. It's not something that would be advantageous to the military in peacetime. A professional military is much better, but a professional military, when deployed, buys time for you to then start to build what people are talking about as this citizen army and build it. And that's how it's happened in every conflict there has been in the past, especially when it's gone on to a global scale. Warfare is high tech. A warfare requires, unfortunately, the human element to be there, and you need people to be able to deal with other people, and you need people and equipment to be able to hold ground, and that's what it's all about. It is a very human activity, a very guttural activity, and requires mass.
Are we going to see an aggressive expansion of military personnel across Europe?
We're already seeing an expansion of expenditure for militaries across Europe. Now, that's just bringing many of the militaries up to the levels that they had signed up to spend 2% of their GDP on defense. Those that are closest to the threat actors, i.e. up against the Russian border, with the Baltic states, Poland, and elsewhere, are spending more. Poland is on a massive expansion capability, buying lots more land and air assets. Germany is on a growth pattern. The Baltic states are on a massive growth pattern. And therefore, I think we need to recognize that from a UK's perspective, we need to grow as well. But it's not just a matter of throwing money at it. It's also a matter of the Ministry of Defence getting into a position where it can use the money that it's got already much more efficiently. We seem to pay over the top for each piece of equipment compared to many of our European neighbours. And this is where the Ministry of Defence needs to really sit down and examine what it requires, how it's going to get it, and how it's going to get it to the front line as quickly as possible. The British Army is just bringing the new Boxer vehicle in. That started to become a requirement almost 20 years ago. We can't have these sorts of long lead times that goes in. So there has to be a refresh of how the Ministry of Defence approaches building capability and makes it more efficient for the taxpayer. And I think underlying this, we are going to have to spend more money on defence.
So is Russia getting stronger then? And what's contributing to this?
There's a lot of disinformation around with regard to Russia, and it's interesting. Russia is telling us that it's getting stronger. But if you start to examine some of the indicators that are out there, and from an intelligence perspective, you always look at what are called indicators and warnings. Russia is losing on the front line Ukraine about 1,000 troops a day. They can't sustain that. They're not recruiting those numbers that come in. They're losing 20 plus tanks, 20 plus artillery systems a day. Their usage of ammunition has dropped off enormously. And whilst Vladimir Putin is saying the Russian defense industrial base can keep the Russian military supplied, the reality is he's relying on ammunition coming from North Korea. That is very unreliable. And relying on technology coming from Iran, which is more reliable, but is not as sophisticated as the Western systems that are shooting it down. And we're also seeing Russia has got an increasing inability to protect inside its own borders, whether that be from air defense systems. We've seen Russian fighter jets shot down by Ukrainian air defense systems. There's a report of a Russian transport aircraft being shot down, and that was over Russia itself. The Ukrainians are now more regularly flying drones against Russian targets as far away as St. Petersburg and Moscow and destroying critical infrastructure, including oil refineries and other things. So Russia is not getting stronger, it's getting weaker, but it's the game of whether we can maintain the political support that there is in the West against the political support that Vladimir Putin is generating by controlling his people and working in his axis of evil that's there, against the military support and the complete destruction of people, equipment, and all the rest of it. That's the balancing act that there is, and there are two timelines working here: a political one and a military one. I would say at the moment the Ukrainians still have the initiative. The Russians are still on the back foot.
What would be the likely outcome if Ukraine fails?
If Ukraine falls, there's two scenarios that come out, and one feeds into the other. The first thing that would happen is we would have another Cold War. We'd have a Berlin Wall type border going from the north of Norway the whole way down to southern Turkey, covering everywhere that's in Russia and all the rest of it. And we would be back to a Cold War level of threat perception. With that, Russia would then start to build its capability, military capability up, learning the lessons it did from Ukraine, and would spend years doing that. But whilst it's doing that, it would continue to try and destabilize the West and NATO, and it would only be a matter of time before it would then attack into NATO. So if we don't stop Russia in Ukraine, yes, we will be paying for this for many, many, many more years to come, and will potentially suffer militarily in the future.
And I guess the elephant in the room is, what are the chances of a nuclear attack?
Well, that's the $6 trillion question, isn't it? Could this lead to nuclear war? I think ever since nuclear weapons were first used by the Americans to end the Second World War with Japan, we've had this policy that developed through the 1950s and 60s of mutually assured destruction, and all sides have got big stakes and can threaten complete annihilation. I think our politicians and decision makers know that, and that has kept us safe from nuclear war ever since the 50s, and I think would probably continue to keep us safe from nuclear exchange between the big states. However, we're getting an increasing number of rogue states that are seeking and are getting access to nuclear weapons, and therefore there is always a potential and an increasing potential that they would use some of these nuclear weapons to further their own aims. That doesn't automatically mean that we would turn into a global nuclear conflict. I think it would focus people politically, and they don't have the same. They don't have this destructive power on the globe that people have when they think of nuclear weapons emotionally, if they're used in a small area and small numbers. But that interstate, inter-major power block nuclear exchanges, I think the policy of mutually assured destruction and the fact that we keep a submarine ready 24 hours a day, hidden somewhere in the seas, as do the Americans, as do the French, as do the Russians, and as do the Chinese, is the thing that keeps us safe.
To summarise then, how realistic is it that we could see compulsory military service happening in the UK?
I think we're a long way off before conscription's coming in, where the average person would be called up to fight Russia. However, the Ukrainians never thought that they would be called up to fight Russia 3 years ago. We're coming up to the second anniversary of Russia's reinvasion of Ukraine, and we're seeing teachers, dentists, lawyers, public service workers, all being called up or volunteering to join the Ukrainian military. So you can't say never for anything. We're just not in that place at the moment.
Thanks, Philip, for joining us.
My pleasure.
Now, if this is the content you like, don't forget to like and subscribe to our TalkTV YouTube page.